welcome back into the Anti-Fragile podcast. With you as always is Dr. Adam Wright, and I am Dr. Nick Holton. Glad to have you back with us. We have recently been diving into some of the kind of synergies between Nassim Nicholas Taleb's original conceptualization of anti-fragility and some of the available psychological science out there on the topic. Most recently, that was through the concept of via negativa, or removal of unnecessary items or things that are not helpful, that are not useful. This particular time, we're going to take a little bit of a left turn here. We've been seeing, I think it's fair to say, Adam, more and more like some kind of, let's call it momentum shifts, right? And how people, I think, are thinking about the emotional experiences, particularly of young people. So this might be parents, this might be coaches, this might be teachers. We'll get into who some of those specific figures are here in a little bit. But I think it affords us an opportunity to spend a little bit of time talking about why we think this kind of concept is a little bit more all-inclusive and just, I guess the simple way to say it is like really, really high utility, right? Like there's a lot of applicability here. And we've spent so much time just talking about the science, like how do we do this? We haven't necessarily spent quite as much time saying like, why should we do this? Or why should a parent or a coach or a mentor, whoever it might be, want this for themselves or for the young person in their lives? So that's kind of the plan today, right? Take that little bit of deviation and then we'll come back to some, I think kind of harder scientific topics in future segments. Okay, so let's start here. Let's actually throw it over to you, and I would love if you just kind of remind people a little bit like, both what you do now, of course, but kind of the quick history. Why is it or how is it that you got to where you are now and the intersection of the different things that you're interested in? Because I think that's going to set up kind of, again, why we think anti-fragility is a really useful term to be thinking seriously about.
I was, in preparing for our episode, I was thinking a little bit about the genesis of why I become interested in this topic and looking for a pathway that's more developmental. And what I came up with is that when I remember graduating with my PhD, and applied sports psychology is, as much as it's developmental, when it comes to doing the work, it's a break-fix mentality. Ultimately, when people were reaching out to me, it was to fix something that was broken. It was not necessary to make things better. I think we talk about it academically, we do research in that, but when I really got down to it and the conversations that were happening, it was just, hey, I'm in a slump. Hey, I'm not optimized. Hey, I'm not seeing the ball well. How can you improve the things that are wrong with me? And beyond that, from the mental health side, it's the same kind of thing. It's psychopathology, it's treating symptoms, it's getting people to zero. Freud said, in terms of therapy, the goal is to make hysterical misery everyday unhappiness. And there has to be something more than that, right? There has to be something about flourishing and thriving once you get to zero. And what is the pathway? And the science is largely disjointed, it's siloed, there's a lot of great information out there. But I'm interested in finding a general recipe and a pathway to apply this with cognition, with behavior, with emotions that allow people to do this in such a way that almost like it's a linear narrative and that we could follow. And we get away from this fixing what's wrong as opposed to building on our strengths.
Okay, so there's, I think, a little bit of our opportunity, I think, to talk about the blend, like where you and I come together, both in terms of like our academic backgrounds and our professional training, but also sort of our practical experiences as well. And so, like anyone who's ever heard me, I'll give the short version of this, on other podcasts. Historically, I was in education, right? And that really came from early coaching experiences, feeling what it felt like to help somebody just sort of generally level up, right? And improve something that they cared about and to play a role in that improvement. That felt good, and so I said, cool, let's go into schools, because there's got to be like ample opportunity to have that experience in schools, right? Which of course there is, but I think like you, inevitably what I found is I was a bit like disenchanted with the overall system through which I thought, it was my bias, like I thought that system should be trying to maximize human potential, and that's not really what I saw, right? And so, somewhat foolishly, I go back, get a PhD and kind of say like, can I get some more answers? And that opens me up to sort of the other end of the spectrum from what you just talked about, which is really like positive psychology and then sort of more broadly, these sciences that are related to human flourishing, generally feeling good, performing well, functioning well, those sorts of things. And so you take that deep dive into that world, and that sounds awesome because it's self-actualization and it's optimization and it's all different types of happiness and it's flourishing and it's just building the good and it's not that break-fix model that you talked about, right? But really early on, you see like this I think terribly fatal flaw that it's kind of evolved from, but it had a real problem with early on and still does to a certain extent, which is like the notion of positive psychology oftentimes shoved out the proper place, right, and the utility of unpleasant emotion and unpleasant experiences. And so when you combine that with, and we're skipping forward a little bit, but things like, pick your moniker, but snowplow parenting or helicopter parenting or, snowplow is like remove all the obstacles. When you combine that with rising levels of comfort, right? When you combine that with easier ways to sort of like circumvent like traditional forms of work and things like that, what you actually, I think what we started to see is, sure, happiness and thriving has this really important role to play, right? Like we're not denying that, but we can't forget about this sort of other end of the emotional spectrum, if you will, right? And so there's this like really complementary nature of what I think you and I came to this problem with in terms of our individual perspectives, right? And then eventually that sort of lent itself to, well, what we're really talking about then is anti-fragility, right? Does that kind of vibe with your experience?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is focusing solely on happiness and well-being is incomplete, and what I'm saying is focusing on dysfunction and lack of skill is incomplete. And there has to be some kind of happy medium where these things are placed together that allows like kind of this thriving to evolve as a more emergent property, and to find a path to get there that's evidence-based. That's not kind of shooting from the hip, which I often feel like we do in applied sports psychology. We just throw a bunch of theories and a bunch of fixes at the problem. Could be really helpful. And it's not the only way, but it may be one way to explore for some people in some cases.
And this is, to me, it appropriately, both academically and practically, really can kind of fill this gap or this niche where we're not talking about like, hardening people through like the introduction of intentional trauma and things like that, right? We're talking about helping people figure out how to thoughtfully and practically help steel themselves, right? Like the stealing up effect, as they'd say it in some of the papers we've been reading, or the people around them for what inevitably is going to come, right? Which is just hard shit, difficult stuff, whatever that might be. That could be as simple as failing a test or not making a soccer team, to a terrible breakup, to the loss of a loved one, or, you can name it. But those things are coming. And so I think more and more you're kind of seeing this movement among parents and coaches to say like, yeah, I'm not trying to return to this sort of, let's call it semi-traditional, often maybe borderline toxic approach of like this really hard discipline, maybe punishment-focused sort of parenting. But that doesn't necessarily mean I want my kid to just have it easy street as well. And so how do I thoughtfully and in a really science-backed way go about helping, my child to do that? I get this question all the time from from clients who are also parents. I'm thinking of one in particular that has twins, and he's he lives this idea of anti-fragility, but I think that has led to such success. This is quote unquote the price of privilege, right? That he worries those same sort of behaviors and attitudes are being instilled in his kids. And so people are looking for resources.
Bringing together scientific rigor with some kind of personal developmental framework that somehow emphasizes growth through adversity, and recognizing that we use the word trauma as if everyone's going to experience the same event as traumatic, and understand there are subjective experiences to potentially traumatic events, and the more we can provide skills to people for what is to come or what we intentionally approach, right, the better they are, and less likely they will experience a trauma, and just the opposite, they're going to experience growth.
Yeah. Yeah, this really is a both and. We're talking about skill sets that can help you understand what it means to feel good, to thrive, depending on your definition, to like really self-actualize and build out your potential. But it also not only acknowledges, it completely aligns with and agrees with the wealth of research that would show you have to be able to round out the all the emotional edges, the unpleasant edges as well, if you really want to maximize some of that growth and potential, right? Like those things are coming. We may as well take an anti-fragile mindset to them, right? So it's this both and, right? We're not trying to take sides here, eliminate. Like there's a lot to be said for building the good, but also learning how to take on and thoughtfully and intentionally, strategically navigate the bad. Okay, so with this both and, right, we're acknowledging, yes, the thriving part, that's what anti-fragility is, right? Thriving through and really because of some of these different adversities, chaos, uncertainty, those sorts of things. So again, if we come back to this question of why, well, we also need to be prepared potentially for these different types of adversity. So what is that? That's uncertainty, that's chaos, that's volatility, those sorts of things. Well, anyone that is paying any attention whatsoever to any news source, I think is going to be acutely aware, like we live in pretty, you could argue interesting, you could also argue like tumultuous times, right? You want to take geopolitics on an international scale, you want to talk for young people, you're really competing in a globalized world where you can really tap sort of labor markets from sort of any corner of the globe. We're talking about the advancement of AI, different levels of competition. These are all things that I think are creating a need for people to have skills and adaptability, to understand what is going to help them generally find synergy and feel good, but to also understand like there's an opportunity, but nonetheless a difficult road ahead of them, right, to seize that opportunity, and they really have to start building up those skills now. But if that alone isn't like reason enough for listeners to say like, yes, I need to start trying to build this up in my kids or the people I can potentially influence, then just consider kind of the case from the, let's call it the mental health perspective, which I want you to talk about a little bit here, Adam.
At this point, I think we're all aware, coming out of COVID, the alarming trends we've seen. And COVID wasn't the cause; it threw gas on the fire, because this was an ongoing issue. But if you're a parent, or if you're a coach, or if you're a teacher or a clinician, clinically, from a case study perspective, we're seeing this all the time in our offices, on the field, in our classrooms, and the CDC, supports I think our daily experience, where we've seen an uptick of like 42% of high school students are reporting persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness. Now, if you look, what was it before? Last studies like from 2010, they were about 28%. It was significant then, but it is extremely problematic now. And the question is why? And I think there's some interesting research being done right now, like Jonathan Haidt and others, that are looking for to better understand, what this uptick is really about. But there is no escaping it. Something has changed. And obviously we'll talk a little more about this in terms of social media and other aspects of technology.
Well, so there's a good segue, right? So I'll make one comment that'll bridge us in there, but let's just like put a pin in Jonathan Haidt's name there for a second and come back to what he's doing, because it's you and I think, really like it. I've got a brother-in-law who's a principal that's implementing some of those ideas in his school right now, having a lot of success. I see it a lot in the education circles, having a lot of success. It's something worth talking about, and I think it's relevant to the idea of distress tolerance and anti-fragility, right? But at the most basic level, I think Haidt's also illustrating a really important point. Young people don't really often know enough about what is gonna lead to actual well-being and happiness, right? And it's not just young people, by the way, I shouldn't just point the finger, but they tend to have, let's say, less information, less sort of anecdata, if you will. And, adults too, but like we often sort of mismatch, right, our desire from what is actually going to make us feel content or happy. And so I think like we're about to get into the distress tolerance piece in terms of addiction and some of Haidt's work and those sorts of things. But again, we are still making the case that at minimum, anti-fragility can set people up to better understand kind of scientifically what's most predictive of like high quality of life and what that really means and sort of organize around it, right?
The issue is, as a parent, right, we want to protect our kids, particularly coming out of COVID. I think we become hyper vigilant in protecting our kids from suffering and pain. But then when you look at the research, it's clear that adolescents who face moderate adversity, rather than being shielded from it, report better long-term mental health outcomes. Right. But there's a disconnect.
Okay, so great, like we established that, we set it aside for a second. Let's come back to Jonathan Haidt. And so just to provide context for anyone that's unaware, Haidt's got a semi-recent, relatively new book still, The Anxious Generation, where he really sort of tackles the data, right, and the trends around mental health, especially amongst young people. That in turn, I think, has led him to really kind of go on this speaking tour, right, and sort of advocating for these really four, and I'm not going to remember the exact list of four, but I believe it's 4 simple rules around smartphone use and young people, specifically around middle school ages and then high school ages and sort of different levels and ways of doing it, and then how schools can adopt this as well. Okay, so why do we bring up something like this? Okay, you might look at a device like a smartphone and think, oh, the young person can watch a video, chat with their friends, get on social, watch something funny, right? It is a constant dopamine trigger, right? And they can say yes, and they can say yes, and they can say yes. And so on the surface, that might sound like it ought to lead to a lot of pleasantness and happiness, right? But what we actually see in a lot of cases, now there's, in fairness, Adam, and I don't know if you want to comment on this at all, but there is some debate here. Not everyone agrees with like Haidt and sort of the causal mechanism. We should be fair about that. So in this particular case, if that is actually causing concerns around mental health, we might ask why, right? And so that's where we come back to ideas like distress tolerance and anti-fragility. So in our podcast, Flourish FM, we had on, Adam, you know this, right? Dr. Anna Lemke, who's an addiction specialist at Stanford, and she's got a great book called Dopamine Nation. And I'm going to give a little bit of the spoiler here, but the basic takeaway is that kind of dopamine and happiness has a little bit of a paradoxical relationship. In order to get kind of the biggest relative dopamine boost, right, you actually really have to restrict in periods, right, from time to time. In other words, you can't just constantly say yes, or you're going to build up a tolerance to the point where the thing no longer brings you happiness, right? You're basically going to like numb yourself to it and dull yourself to it, anesthetize yourself to it to a certain extent. And that at least, and I want to be cautious with our assertions here, but that at least from a kind of neuroscience perspective is some mechanistic I think theory at least, that underlies part of what Haidt is pointing out. And so why do we bring that up? Well, you got to have distress tolerance, right? That should signal to people, help the young people in my life develop the ability to say no, or to have discipline, or to regulate some of their feelings or cravings or whatever it might be. And that's just for starters, right? What would you add, if anything, to that, Adam?
No, I think you ticked all the boxes. I think at the same time, I want to consider the alternative ideas around Haidt's work, because I think it's important to recognize both sides of this, to be fair.
So let's do that, and then let me just rattle off a list of where like what we just said might be applicable, and then let's shift and bring in that other perspective. So I mentioned smartphones, but if we're just thinking about a quick list, this could apply to vapes. This could apply to social media in general. This could apply to shopping. This could apply to sugar. This could apply to pornography. Anything that is potentially addictive and destructive. You got to remember this paradox, kind of like withdrawal and the distress tolerance and the boredom, or like the discipline required to not engage in that craving, ultimately is something that can lead to well-being, right? That it's a little counterintuitive, but let's just leave it there, and then go into the kind of counter perspective here.
So number one, understanding this research, first of all, is there's always going to be problems with correlational research. right? You're always going to find holes in it, and I want to put that part aside. That's the scientific part aside, because I think there's some fairly strong criticisms with his idea of kind of safetyism and this concept that he uses. You know, I don't know. The argument is he doesn't necessarily address the role of trauma-informed practices to the degree for marginalized groups, for people with adverse childhood experiences. Sometimes he overuses the word trauma, and it could seem dismissive of people that have real psychological trauma who really do need accommodations. I think that's one. And I think there's another element too. It's like, his arguments sometimes around free speech and anti-fragility and stuff, like they're ignoring some bigger issues around systemic inequality. Like you gotta bring the right and the oppression, all like you can't just push that aside, right? You may need a safe space. I don't necessarily like that word, but you may need a space to retreat to in which you feel emotionally supported, right? That you can navigate in an environment, right, that you feel hostile. I'm a white dude, middle-aged guy. How do I know what you experience as hostile as a person of a marginalized group? So you got to be really careful in terms of this frame. Go ahead.
Well, no, that's exactly it. Is when we start to, and we need to, like we being a larger sort of research community, need to pick apart, like what exactly does that sort of distress tolerance or anti-fragility, the notion that we can gain good from bad, basically, right? How might that differ when it tips over the line into something that might be more objectively considered trauma, right? We know about post-traumatic growth, but those are like the slippery slope I think you want to be very careful of and that you're thoughtfully pointing out, right? And at the same time, part of the issue, and I think this makes a lot of sense with Haidt's work, is that idea of safetyism. It's very clear in anti-fragility and to a certain extent resilience research and stress research, there is actually a sweet spot, right? And when you underdo levels of challenge or responsibility or sort of distress tolerance or those sorts of things that force a young person to sort of grow, they don't have the opportunity to build those skills. When you overdo them, which I think you're wisely pointing out and referencing, like it can become actually dangerous, okay? But that's not an either or. We're trying to figure out is kind of that both and, that sweet spot right in between them, I think, right? Is that a fair way of saying it?
It's a fair way to say it. And then the other element is like, hey, there's some positive aspects of social media, right? There's research to sports, positive identity formation, social connection, mental health support, right? Whether it's online groups or activism, or the idea is that we have to take a more nuanced understanding about how social media impacts adolescents on a whole, acknowledging its risks, but at the same time, there are benefits. Personally, I know for my child, listen, if we didn't have that during COVID, as an only child, he would have been in pretty bad shape. And it turned out it was great. He used social media to connect with his friends, played Xbox with chats and so forth. He continued to develop. He didn't regress, and it wasn't solidified at a certain point in time because he had that access.
There's a lot of stories like that, right? And I think again, and this is mentioned in the literature, but I think it's an important distinction. In some cases, the conceptual difference between resilience and anti-fragility, or the mindset, the distinct mindset, is resilience is really about reduction and conservation of resources. It's, in other words, avoiding additional bad.
Right.
That's a totally different thing than an anti-fragile frame, which is actually approach behaviors towards the adversity or the uncertainty because we think it's going to sharpen the blade, so to speak, right? And again, you've pointed out wisely and thoughtfully that there are dangerous sort of upper limits of that, but again, we're talking about a totally different sort of behavior set, right?
Yeah, and there's one other, and spending a lot of time in professional sports with that 17 through 25, 28-year-old, whether it's millennials or Gen Z, sometimes as older white males like Haidt, sometimes I feel like it can be unfair criticizing Gen Z and millennials with their mental health struggles because you don't fully understand the unique pressures and challenges that they experience in today's, it's a digital, it's a globalized world. We didn't experience that. So I think we're really quick to criticize newer trends without fully grasping or considering all the benefits as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's worth mentioning, right? And you're exactly right. I would always tell people during my many years teaching in LA in particular, that crowd was, I think, very much a work hard, play hard sort of crowd. And they had to. Like, there were certain pressures, there were certain expectations, there were certain levels of rigor that I certainly did not have in school, right? Nor would I want. And I think the point there, the insight, ought to be that when any time you're talking about, let's say, a trait, right, or behavior set, those things are often context dependent. So like, what do we mean? Like, you're not just anti-fragile or fragile or resilient. You're
Right.
probably fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile to different degrees in different environments and different contexts, right?
Yes.
And so that same, let's say, group, this is a kind of a trivial example, but the same group that was super gritty about their academics and their studying and their organization, their preparedness, we do like a freshman year trip down, like canoeing down the Colorado River, like get out of here with that group. Like, couldn't handle the dirt, couldn't handle the bugs, couldn't handle the what, like none of that. And it's just a good example of where, okay, where might you sort of round out your edges in contexts that would be useful and helpful and still moderately safe, but sort of push the boundaries of challenge and discomfort in healthy ways, right? That prepare and steel you, right? Or the people around you. Okay, cool. So this has been a conversation a little bit more about like why anti-fragility, why is this particular lens, perspective, mindset sort of all-inclusive, kind of integrates a lot of different approaches and psychological ideas, and we think ultimately could play a really, really important role, especially for young people, kind of given the upcoming and, well, really current and upcoming challenges that they'll be facing. So check back in with us next time. We'll come back to the science a little bit more and be diving into some new topics. Thanks for joining us.